Gisela was born on November 24, 1924, in Tarnow, Poland. She lived in Tarnow before the war and for the first 2 years of the war. Her family was very religious. Her father was a pious Jew with a beard and never tolerated anything that wasn't kosher. Her dad opened a big dairy on Falkison Street where they would deliver milk to homes on a horse carriage. It was the only big kosher dairy in Tarnow. Both of her parents were fluent in Polish and were literate, but Mom was more fluent than the dad and also spoke German. Her family lived on Spitalad Street, which literally translates to Hospital Street.
Gisela went to a normal public Polish school, where both Polish and Jewish kids attended. Most of the teachers in the public school were Polish. Gisela didn't really experience anti-Semitism, and she said sometimes there'd be something slightly unpleasant. All of her friends there were Jewish. The first bomb was in Tarnow, even before the war broke out. It was at a train station, and the building collapsed there. Out of a transport, Gisela had a friend for some time. The friend didn't speak Polish, and she was so unhappy. Gisela decided to teach her Polish. When the German army was marching in and tanks were entering the city, Gisela remembers everyone was scared, and of course nobody knew how it would turn out. They were saying it wouldn't last long, that it would change, and that England and France would help. Then they were still living alone in their apartment. But at the end of 1940, or at the beginning of 1941, they started evicting Jews from certain areas, and also an entire transport of Jews came from Plock, and the Jewish community had to place them somewhere. Since Gisela's family had 2 rooms, they took one room away from them and put a family of 5 there. Gisela's family of 5 had to stay in one room. By this time, it was already 1942. Then the first big action or liquidation of Jews took place, during which a lot of people died. Gisela and her family managed to survive because Germans would search by last name, and if they found someone, they would take everyone that lived there. And luckily, they weren't on that list. It was the first mass execution. Before the first action in June 1942, the ghetto wasn't closed yet, and their house remained in the ghetto. But after that action, the ghetto got smaller and was surrounded by a partition, and the house they lived in was outside the ghetto. So they were forced to move. They moved into the area of that destroyed synagogue. While living in the ghetto, despite all the hardships, there were no excuses when it came to keeping everything kosher. In order to get food, Gisela had to sell whatever things they had left. Gisela and her family survived the second action in September of 1942 because they all went into hiding. She and her sister hid in one of the basements in their house. Her parents were able to survive and hide somewhere else. During Yom Kippur in the ghetto in 1942, Gisela rebelled and decided not to fast, which was hard because her family was very religious and they did not have much to eat.
Gisela knew that there would be another action soon. When everyone started saying that an action is about to happen, Gisela left the ghetto on a Sunday, and on the next day they took her parents and her brother. During the third action in November of 1942, Gisela lost her family and only her and her sister survived. On the day of the action, her sister went to work, and Gisela had escaped from the ghetto a week earlier and stayed at a friend's who she had met at school and had taught Polish, Gabriela. Gabriela managed to sneak into the ghetto and picked Gisela up from the inside. Gisela had escaped without an armband. But Gisela didn't have the proper papers to leave further. She was able to get some sort of ID, but it wasn't what she needed in order to leave freely because she didn't have the money she needed. So she had to hide. Gisela's sister was struggling and wanted her to come back to the ghetto because she couldn't live alone in an empty apartment. Since Gisela couldn't go anywhere, she decided to go back into the ghetto, and she snuck in with the people who had returned for work. When Gisela went back to the ghetto, she didn't have permission to work, but she worked hard and was able to go back to the same company she had worked with previously. She worked there with her sister for one more year until the end of the summer of 1943. Later, it turned out it wasn't a total liquidation, but they moved most of the people. She and her sister ended up in Plaszow and stayed there for a year. In August of 1944, they were moved to Auschwitz, specifically Birkenau. In Auschwitz, they shaved their heads, took away their clothing, and put them in barracks with 100 people. There they worked physically and barely survived the laborious demands. In Birkenau, Giselle and her sister stuck together with 3 more friends they knew from Plaszow. They were all sent to Stutthof transport, but luckily she and her sister were saved by their uncle. Her uncle was on the other side of the fence and recognized Giselle and her sister. They told him that they were about to be transported, and he got their tattoo numbers and managed to get them out of the transport. But those friends went and did not survive. Giselle and her sister stayed in the mostly empty camp for a few months until the end of December of 1944.
On December 30th, 1944, Gisela and her sister were taken to Bergen-Belsen in one of the last mass transports. They were put in barracks where the conditions were very primitive and were way too crowded. That was when their starvation truly began. Gisela caught typhus at the camp, but managed to get better. But when her sister got sick, she got worse and worse every day. And then the English came and liberated them. However, they were too late to save Gisela's sister. If they had come a week earlier, there would have been a chance. But her sister was like a skeleton then, and it was too late for everything. They were freed on April 15th, and she died April 23rd. And when the English came, they said through the speakers not to worry, that they were free. Gisela remembers that she wasn't even joyful. She had no idea how to be happy. Gisela couldn't believe it was really the end, and wasn't really conscious of anything.
After the liberation, they were fed, and after a while they began moving everyone to different places. Gisela was sent to the Belgian border and then took up to Diepholz, then to Linge, and they were being moved every couple weeks. But finally they decided to move her back to Bergen-Belsen. During that time, refugees from Poland began to come. Entire transports came, and Gisela's future husband, Leon, got there from Russia.